Jay Bilas joining us on the program. Jay, what's on your mind today?
Not much, Dan. I just first, I am really glad you are hosting Undeniable. That's one of my favorite shows, and you are a fabulous interviewer. In fact, I think you are still the only broadcast journalist to ever be shouted at by a commissioner from the podium during the draft when David Stern jumped down your throat. I don't know how many 10 years ago or so when we were working together.
Yep. That was a rough draft night there for me when the commissioner shouted out, because we're told the commissioner's coming out with the card. So I said, let's go to the commissioner, and he didn't come out. So I said, Commissioner, I was like, come here, come on out, wherever you are. And then he came out and they verbally spanked me. But he's verbally spanked me a few times there.
I think it said something about your pithy commentary or something.
Yes.
I was very impressed. But not many guys can get the commissioner to shout them out without actually being drafted.
What else is on your mind today?
Not much. I mean, I don't know why you're having me on. I just texted Fritzy when somebody had mentioned that the idea of a placeholder, and I just texted him. Well, Manny Diaz was a placeholder at Temple. I mean, it's interesting. I don't have any problem with what coaches do. If coaches want to break a contract, or if an employer wants to let a coach out of a contract to go to another job, Lynn Swann can allow Cliff Kingsbury to interview or not. That's business. They pay for that right. The only issue I have is when coaches are allowed to do this willy-nilly and it's no big deal and everybody just says it's business, and then players are said to be breaking commitment. They made a commitment and all this stuff that really makes no sense when they're unpaid amateur students. And that's really the issue that's always sort of riled me up is why do we say somehow that commitment means something sacred when a player makes it, and they're said to be students to be treated like any other student, and when a paid coach can run around do whatever they want. I'm not saying they shouldn't be able to. I'm saying that the players should be allowed to transfer without their former school saying where they can and can't go, and they shouldn't have to sit out a year. They should be able to play the very next year. And I'll give you an example, Dan. Like in basketball, a lot of players, there are probably 75 to 100 players that just transferred during the Christmas break. And the reason they do is so they can be eligible at the start of the next Christmas break. So they don't have to say, and players, you'll hear coaches say all the time, players never stick it out when it gets tough. When adversity hits, they just turn and run. And you say, okay, well, why don't you just let them transfer when they feel like it? But they can't play until the next year. That's a reasonable thing for competition. Well, that means players that are transferring now, basketball players, will stick out the year. They'll play. So you'll get the year of service out of them, and you'll have 6 more months to work it out with them and to reason with them. And maybe they'll work through it and become a starter or become a star, whatever the heck they want to be. And why don't we look at it in a more reasonable fashion than just taking this iron-fisted approach of and it's not just iron-fisted. They're protecting an asset that they have, the universities, and they're basically using this 1 year year in residence rule as the equivalent of a non-compete provision for an employee. So that's really sort of the issue.
Talking to Jay Bilas from the Mothership, joining us, Dan Patrick Show. If you represented Trevor Lawrence's family, let's say they wanted to challenge this, because he's never going to be hotter than he is today after winning that national title, but could you present a case in a courtroom that would allow Trevor Lawrence to go to the NFL early?
No, it would never get to a courtroom. Maurice Clarett was the last one to try this. This is all sort of federal antitrust law. There's a it's from the collective bargaining agreement. This issue was collectively bargained between the Players Association and the NFL. So it's a special exception to federal antitrust law. And so what's always been really interesting to me, Dan, is sort of this idea that people say, well, you can go pro in the NBA out of high school because players physically can do it. They can't do it in the NFL. They get killed. Well, that's, first of all, not the reason that there's that 3-year rule. Years and years ago, back when the NFL was just getting started, the NCAA put in a rule that if you worked in any capacity in professional sports, you were no longer eligible to work in college sports. So if you were an official and you refed a game professionally, you could no longer work in college. If you were, an administrator, anything, a coach, and work professionally, you could no longer work in college. So the NFL basically came to the NCAA, which was 10, 20 times bigger than the NFL. It was a fledgling league, the NFL at the time. They came on bended knee and said, listen, don't do this. You'll kill us. We'll never get off the ground. We'll leave your players alone until they graduate. How about that? And that's where the 4-year rule came in. Now, you know why it's 3 now?
No.
The USFL. In 1984, the USFL started drafting juniors, and they were taking the NFL's talent away. And so the NFL had a rule you couldn't draft them till 4 years, till they graduated. And so that's when the NFL changed the rule. And, I heard you guys talking before, and I think you're right. If the NFL had the opportunity, I think it would be just like basketball. If the NFL had the opportunity to draft good talent when it was younger, they'd do it just to get it. If you could draft Trevor Lawrence right now, you'd wait on him because he'd be worth it given the reliance that the NFL has on quarterback play. And so you'd have the same thing now. And I heard the Christian Hackenberg thing. You'd make mistakes. The NFL makes plenty of mistakes in the draft. They make just as many mistakes as the NBA does, and they have 5 years to look at these players. It's not an exact science in any sport. But that's all the draft eligibility rules are. It's 3 years because of a historic precedent that has lasted and that started at 4 and went to 3 because of the USFL. And it was all business. It had nothing to do with whether they could compete or what's fair, or what's American or un-American. It had nothing to do with that. Basketball is a totally different history, and that's why their rule is totally different.
But did David Robinson get paid when he was drafted, 1987, I believe? He sat for 2 years. Was he getting paid by the Spurs?
I don't know, because he was in the Navy at the time, so there were no amateurism issues there. So I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the rules were different in 79 and 78 when Red Auerbach drafted Larry Bird when he was a junior in 1978. Nobody had thought of that before, and there was no rule against it. So Larry Bird did not get any money. They just held his draft right. So in 1979, when he was a senior, he didn't get any money, and there was nothing put in trust. It was just Boston held his rights, and there were some criticism of Red Auerbach at the time saying that, what are you doing? I mean, you're wasting a whole year. And he basically said, you know how little time a year is when you're talking about a great player? He said, this is gonna benefit. And that's when Larry Bird came in and Red Auerbach outsmarted the system, the NBA changed the rule so you couldn't do that anymore, because otherwise you'd have you would have had guys drafting Michael Jordan when he was a freshman or things like that, where you could identify, heck, this player is going to be great. We'd be willing to wait. Heck, we saw the same thing essentially, even though it's a little bit different, but essentially it's the same thing with Joel Embiid. Philly drafted him when he was injured, and they had to wait 2 years. And I remember having the discussion, well, would you take him when he's a junior? Would you use that pick if he was still in college and say, well, wait till you're a junior? Yeah. Of course you would. If you have something transcendent that you think could be, Hall of Fame caliber that's going to last you a dozen years, you give 2 years back on the front end to get an experienced player that's going to last a long time.
I'll leave you with this. If you have the first pick in the NBA draft, who are you taking?
Right now, I'm taking Zion Williamson, but I'm still leaving it open for R.J. Barrett because I think he's James Harden-esque in his ability to get to the basket. Neither one of them shoot it right now, but they both they don't have, bad mechanics. They're just not natural shooters. But I've never seen anything like Zion Williamson on a basketball court, probably because there's never been anybody like him. He's not the best player I've ever seen, but there's never been a player like him to play this game. He's remarkable.
Jay, thanks for joining us as always. We appreciate the time.
Thank you, Dan. Good being with you.
Jay Bilas from the Mothership there.
For more Dan Patrick Show, tune to Audience Channel 239 on DirecTV or download the Dan Patrick Show app.